In March of 1621, the English colonists at Plymouth were starving, freezing, and terrified of the forest around them. Half of them had died in the first winter. The survivors were huddled behind a wooden wall, convinced that the wilderness beyond it was full of savages they could not understand and could not predict. Then a man walked out of the woods, alone, straight into their camp. And he said, "Welcome, Englishmen," in English. The colonists were stunned. They had crossed an ocean to reach what they believed was the edge of the known world, and the first native who approached them greeted them in their own language, asked for beer, and chatted about the captains of fishing ships he knew by name. His name was Samoset. And a few days later, he came back with someone even more shocking, a man named Tisquantum, who spoke English fluently, better than some of the colonists' own servants, because Tisquantum had already lived in Europe. To understand how that's possible, you have to throw away almost everything you were taught about this moment, because the story of natives standing on a beach, amazed by floating houses with white wings, meeting Europeans for the very first time. That story is fiction. By 1620, the coast of New England had been in contact with Europeans for over a century. Basque, French, and English fishing fleets had been working those waters since the early 1500s. They came ashore to dry their catch, trade for furs, and take on water. The coastal nations knew these pale visitors well. They had traded with them, fought with them, learned scraps of their languages, and passed information about them along trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles inland. The ships were not a mystery. They were a seasonal fact of life. And the contact wasn't always friendly. In 1614, an English captain named Thomas Hunt invited a group of natives aboard his ship near the village of Patuxet, supposedly to trade. Then he locked them below deck, sailed to Spain, and sold them as slaves in the port of Málaga. One of the men in that cargo hold was Tisquantum. What happened next sounds like fiction, but it's documented. Tisquantum got out of Spain, possibly with the help of monks who opposed the enslavement. He made his way to London, where he lived for years in the house of a merchant, learned fluent English, and worked as an interpreter. And in 1619, he managed to get himself aboard a ship crossing back to New England. He had spent 5 years trying to get home. When he finally reached his village, Patuxet, he found it empty. Not attacked. Not relocated. Empty. Skeletons in the houses, fields growing wild. Everyone he had ever known was dead. Because while Tisquantum was in Europe, something had swept the coast of New England that killed more people than any war in the region's history. Between 1616 and 1619, an epidemic, brought by European contact, burned through the coastal nations. Historians estimate that in some communities, the death rate reached 90%. 9 out of 10 people, gone in 3 years. Entire villages stood abandoned, with cleared fields and stored corn, and no one alive to use them. European traders sailing the coast in those years described it as a graveyard. And here is the detail that gets left out of the story every single time. When the Pilgrims arrived in 1620 and chose a place to build their colony, they picked a site with cleared farmland, a good harbor, and fresh water, conveniently already prepared, as if someone had made it ready for them. They built Plymouth on the ruins of Patuxet. The colony that became the symbol of America's founding was built on the empty site of Tisquantum's dead village. The fields the Pilgrims planted their first crops in had been cleared by the very people the epidemic erased. So now look at that famous first meeting again, from the other side of the beach. The natives watching the Mayflower were not awestruck primitives seeing gods arrive. They were survivors of an apocalypse, watching a small, sick, starving group of foreigners move into a graveyard, and their leaders made decisions accordingly. Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoag Confederation, had lost most of his people to the plague. His rivals inland, the Narragansett, had barely been touched by it, and they knew he was weak. So when Massasoit looked at the struggling English colony, he didn't see invaders to repel or gods to worship. He saw a potential ally with guns. The treaty he made with Plymouth in 1621 wasn't naivety. It was geopolitics, a calculated alliance by a leader trying to rebalance power in a region that disease had turned upside down. And the famous harvest feast that Americans now call the first Thanksgiving was not a friendly dinner between neighbors. It was a diplomatic summit between two nations that each needed something from the other. The English needed food and knowledge to survive. Tisquantum taught them how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, where to catch eels, how to survive the land, standing in the fields of his own dead village, teaching strangers to farm the soil his family had cleared. And the Wampanoag needed a military ally against their rivals. Both sides got what they wanted. For a while. So the real story of that beach is not wonder. It's not simplicity. And it's not fiction about floating islands and white gods. It's a story about survivors of the greatest catastrophe in their history, making hard strategic choices with incomplete information, while one man who had been kidnapped, enslaved, and dragged across the world stood between two civilizations as the only person alive who fully understood both. History always looks different depending on which side of the beach you're standing on, and for a very long time, we only told it from the boat.